Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Incoming transmission.
Hello, this is Matt and McKinley from History Dispatches.
We are the father-son duo bringing you the weird, the wild, the wacky, and the craziest tales from across time.
From the Ice Bowl
to the Great Heathen Army.
And the head of Oliver Cromwell.
The same head they kept on a pike for 3 years?
Yep, all here on History Dispatches.
New episodes every weekday.
Find out more at historydispatches.com or wherever you get your podcast app.
Hello, and thank you for listening to the History of World War II podcast, episode 529, interview with author Jonathan Horn about his book, The Fate of Generals, MacArthur, Wainwright, and the Epic Battle for the Philippines. Mr. Horn is a former White House presidential writer whose earlier books include Washington's End and The Man Who Would Not Be Washington, Robert E. Lee's Civil War, and his decision that changed American history. Mr. Horn, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. It's a line, and we're going to go into this, but your book, I mean, it's obvious that you're a speechwriter because the book was just well written. But I did notice something when I was looking at your older books. I got a sense of string theory. Let me explain that. So before we talk about MacArthur and Wainwright, as touching your 3 books, you start with Washington, then you go to Lee, and you kind of compare the two, or at least a decision that they had to make in regards to a war. And then in Fate of Generals, you start out the book about Douglas MacArthur's idolizing his father who fought in the Civil War. And you can tell me, but I almost just saw this string theory connection going through the 3 books.
I think that's right. And one of the things I discovered as I was working on this book about World War II, is my first about World War II,
right.
Is that generation felt very close to the Civil War. And those, American history is not very long. Douglas MacArthur's father had received the Medal of Honor during the Civil War. He had received it at the Battle of Chattanooga. He had carried his regiment's flag up Missionary Ridge in November 1863. Right. A lot of other people did similar things, but MacArthur received the Medal of Honor for that, and it played a big role in shaping his son's outlook on life. And Wainwright had very close ties to the Civil War, and you could see him thinking about the Civil War as he made decisions in the Philippines. And so that was almost their version of World War II for them, was the Civil War.
Right. Because you get a sense that for these gentlemen, and I'm sure others, but when you become an officer, the higher in rank you go, not only does politics start to intrude, but also thinking about your place in history. And how could these gentlemen not think? And I don't think that's ego. I think that's human nature. But how could they not think of a bigger picture years, decades from now, when 2 people would be talking about a book that one of them wrote? So I guess that's kind of in the back of their head.
Absolutely, and especially in the case of Douglas MacArthur, from the very beginning of his life, he knew that his parents expected big things of him. His mother talked all the time to him about Robert E. Lee. Of course, his father was a Union Civil War hero, and
right.
Even at West Point, as a cadet, he began assembling a record of success at the academy that was compared and likened to Robert E. Lee's record of success. So I think from the very beginning, especially of his life, he saw big things for himself. And same thing with General Wainwright in different ways. He had grown up near the site of Custer's last stand and near the site of the Little Bighorn in Montana. And for the rest of his life, he read every single book he could find about General Custer. He became somewhat obsessed with this battle. And of course, Custer had also fought in the Civil War. We remember him for the Indian Wars, but he, of course, was a very successful cavalry commander during the Civil War. And of course, Wainwright becomes obsessed with his last stand, never knowing that he himself is going to have to fight a last stand of his own in the Philippines during World War II.
Right. And so as we're reading the book, we get to see the connections that he would have to put together decades later. And when I got to that part of the book, I found it so interesting and a reminder that parents, that family can set a child on their course by their expectations about the way they treat them, what they expect of them. My father was in the military, but the only thing for us was don't get in trouble. Whereas they were saying to these, at least MacArthur was like, we expect huge things of you. How could you not want to try to fill your parents' hopes?
Definitely, and especially in MacArthur, he is just raised to do big things,
Right.
and also to fulfill, in a sense, his father's birthright. And I think you can see that with his relationship to the Philippines. It was Douglas MacArthur's father, Arthur. Of course, he had fought in the Civil War, but he had been just 18 years old at the time. What he most accomplished was during the Spanish-American War, when he led the very first American troops inside the walled city of Manila in the Philippines in 1898 and saw the American flag raised over the city. And of course, the Philippines from that would become a colony of the United States. That's sort of the origin story for the Philippines being a part of the United States as we go into World War II. And Arthur MacArthur had then served as military governor of the Philippines, and he had told his son and told the world, but his son really absorbed it, that the Philippines was the key position to America's future as a Pacific power. And he also felt that in some ways, the Philippines might hold the key to the future of democracy all over the world. So this is Douglas MacArthur's birthright, in a sense. And that's where he is, of course, in right before World War II, when he has this assignment to defend the Philippines.
That's well said. I never thought of it like that. And also, of course, that partially explains his I'll just use the word obsession or focus in defending the Philippines, demanding from George Marshall supplies that there's no way that they can deliver them, certainly not on time, but he just could not let that idea go. So we'll get into that a little bit later. So you've got MacArthur, who's larger than life, and you've got Wainwright, who should be larger than life, but and we'll get into that, but it just didn't play out that way in history. So let me ask you this: so you had this divergence of popularity, if I can. What inspired you to tell these two general stories together, and why do you think it's important to see their paths in tandem together as well?
Well, I'll be honest. I think what first drew me to MacArthur really were those three famous words he issued, "I shall return." Right. And everybody knows that vow. He said that vow after he had been ordered out of the Philippines in 1942 with his army facing starvation and surrender, and ordered to go to Australia with his family, where he promises to return. But very few people remember the vow that General Wainwright made. General Wainwright became the top commander in the Philippines after MacArthur was ordered out, and he vowed on the first page of a diary that he began on April 2nd, 1942, to stay with his men, to share their fate, even if that meant surrendering with them and becoming, as he eventually did, the highest ranking American prisoner of war of World War II. So my feeling was, as I was looking at these two vows, that you couldn't understand the significance of MacArthur's vow to return unless you also understood the story of the general who vowed to stay.
Right.
And then I got was a pretty big break. It had been more than 40 years since anyone had written a biography of General Wainwright. And in that time, his diary, his personal letters, other documents regarding his family had been deposited in government and military archives in Carlisle and at West Point. And in many cases, as a result, because there hadn't been a new biographer of Wainwright coming through, these papers had really never been explored at all in some cases. So there was an opportunity to be able to tell his story in a way never before possible.
Don't miss your chance to spring into deals at Lowe's. Right now, get a free 60-volt Toro battery when you purchase a select 60-volt Toro electric mower. Plus, buy 3 19.3-ounce vegetable and herb Bonnie plants for just $10. It's time to give your yard a grow-up. Lowe's. We help. You save. Valid through 4/23. Selection varies by location. While supplies last. Discount taken at time of purchase. Actual plant size and selection varies by location. Excludes Alaska and Hawaii.
Right, and I'm glad you did. I'm glad you put it that way because of those papers and the fact that there hadn't been a biography for a while. That again is indicative of how he's just been, kind of glossed over or forgotten, or a footnote, a MacArthur footnote, if you will. So you've got these two very different promises. So how does that shape the way we remember the war with these two gentlemen?
Well, I think obviously the phrase "I shall return" is one of the most famous phrases from World War II.
Right.
And MacArthur played no small part in making it so, of course. He was a master of public relations. And it wasn't also just about promoting himself. Those words meant so much to people in the Philippines during World War II.
Yeah.
During the years of Japanese occupation, those were dark years for the people of the Philippines. They remained loyal. Obviously, we're speaking broadly,
right.
Not everybody, but the population generally did remain loyal to the United States. And it was dark years, and people took great faith in Douglas MacArthur's vow to return. And of course, the vow itself became something of a national commitment, and it didn't have to turn out that way because no one had authorized Douglas MacArthur to say, "I shall return" in that exact way.
Right.
And during different points during World War II, you see at a very high level people saying returning to the Philippines is a detour from the more important goal of defeating Japan.
Right.
But MacArthur never saw it that way, and I think it goes back to what you were saying. The reason he doesn't see it that way is because of his deep connection to the Philippines, and because he believes we were forced out of those islands at the point of a bayonet, and the only way to return is the same way. This is American soil, and we have a moral obligation, is how he describes it, to return to these islands. And so that phrase becomes so famous that I think Wainwright's vow to stay, in a sense, becomes a footnote, as you put it, to the life of Douglas MacArthur. And Wainwright was famous. I don't want to say he wasn't famous. When he returned from World War II in September 1945 to the United States, he had a ticker tape parade in New York City.
Yeah.
He received the Medal of Honor from President Truman.
Mm-hmm.
But he has sort of slipped in and been forgotten. I think a large part of that was because it had been so long since anyone had written a book about him.
Good point. And I think it's fair to say, I read this somewhere years ago, but I think it's fair to say that MacArthur, in a lot of ways, practically invented PR, military PR. I mean, he was his own PR machine. It was I, when there's obviously a staff, there's obviously, thousands of soldiers fighting, but it's I. And in that, it's almost like Caesar's Commentaries. He stuck himself right there in the history. That's not going to be a name that you're not going to forget because you keep hearing it all the time. Whereas with Wainwright, like you said, it's been a while since a book has been written. So I guess it tends to fade from memory or history.
Right. And one of MacArthur's biographers looked at the communiques he issued during his time in the Philippines before he left. And just a crazy percentage of them only mentioned one man, and that was Douglas MacArthur himself. Right. And of course, that played no small role, in a sense, in the decision to order MacArthur out of the Philippines. And because, of course, when you think about it, this is essentially, in the way Roosevelt himself sees it, is the captain deserting the sinking ship. This is something that no general would ever really want to do. And to be fair to MacArthur, it wasn't his idea. I think he was legitimately willing to die in the Philippines. I don't think he would have been willing to do what Wainwright did and become a prisoner of war, but I think he was willing to die.
Right.
And he gets this order to come out. And the reason is, if you look at the situation in March 1942, all across the Pacific, the Japanese are succeeding with very little resistance in Hong Kong, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Guam, Wake Island. Only in the Philippines can Americans find what they so desperately want, evidence that we are fighting back. And that fight becomes synonymous with MacArthur, even though, ironically, he's not. He only makes one visit to Bataan, the peninsula, where most of the fighting is happening. And of course, it's Wainwright who's on the front lines with the men there.
Right. But you make a good point, because it's MacArthur's self-promotion that, in a political sense, not a military sense, that makes him so valuable. It's like, we're losing all these territories. Is there anything we can save? And the answer is yes, we can save MacArthur. Yes, the president does have to order him out of there, but the Americans took it as a win at a very dark time, and because he's this larger than life, and And in your book, the newspaper headlines about MacArthur, it sounded like he was personally just slapping Japanese troops all over the place, which of course he wasn't. But he was the hero, the bright spot that we needed in late 41, early 42. And he didn't mind that. We'll leave it at that. He didn't mind so much. But and you brought up something a minute ago, having access to the letters and diaries and other documents of Wainwright. Out of all of the stuff that you read and that you came across, was there anything that surprised you or anything like that during that research to make you go, oh, okay, I think I understand this man a little bit better now?
There really were some revelations for me as I was looking through his diary and the letters he wrote. And I think about, the vow he made. We knew about that vow before, but still seeing it on a piece of paper on April 2nd and realizing that one page is going to set the tone for everything that follows in the diary. That is a striking thing to see in someone's diary, that they know what's going to happen to them.
Yeah.
But I also think about other things. For the rest of his Wainwright's life, he was very careful about the way he talked about Douglas MacArthur. And people always wanted to know, what did Wainwright really think about Douglas MacArthur?
Right.
And he would say, when pressed, Douglas MacArthur was one of the 3 best soldiers America ever produced. If you're curious, the other 2 were Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, in Wainwright's opinion. And one clue to understanding that is in Wainwright's diary. He writes a list of rules for young officers, and prominent among them is never criticize your commanding officer. Right. And even Wainwright's own son conceded late in life that nobody would ever really know what his dad thought of MacArthur. And I think about some of the really moving entries that Wainwright made during his time in prison. The Japanese moved him from the Philippines to Taiwan and eventually all the way to Manchuria.
Wow.
In 1945, he's facing negative 49-degree temperatures.
Right.
His body begins to break down, and he thinks he might not make it. And there's this one entry that, I just really stayed with me, where he says, I fought for life in the Philippines, and I'm going to fight for life now. And no one called me yellow then, and no one will call me yellow now. And just to see that, and also just to see the pages he devoted to worrying that Americans wouldn't understand the decision he made to surrender for the sake of his men.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think I kind of forgot it. But when I got to that part of the book, the Japanese made it quite clear. Look, you surrender, but you don't just surrender your men. You have to make everybody in the Philippines, a lot of islands, you have to make everybody surrender, or we're going to continue the war as ongoing, which of course means we're going to slaughter a lot of you, because they were running out of food. There were like thousands of them in medical beds or whatever. And it would have been a monumental bloodbath. So he did what he did to save them. It wasn't cowardice. He was thinking of the larger picture. But I can't help find it a little bit ironic. MacArthur leaves, and he's the hero. Wainwright stays and suffers, and he's semi-forgotten. But again, and I'm sure you know this better than I do, it's all about getting, word of mouth, getting your name out there, PR, that kind of stuff. Wainwright did not focus on that, and MacArthur did. So he's the bigger man in history. But again, Wainwright was like this quiet, straight line waver. He never wavers. And when you said a minute ago that when he said you don't speak ill of your superior, I can't help but think that's part of the gentlemanly code. But having said that, there were times earlier before the war came where they were looking at MacArthur's plan about defending the Philippines. They're like, I don't see this happening. But you're the general. We will do what you say.
Right. I'm glad you brought that up, because MacArthur did have a different plan to defend the Philippines. There was an old plan in effect, and MacArthur basically threw it out shortly before World War II. And his plan basically depended on raising a large number of Philippine conscripts who had passed through training camps that he had been running on the islands. And his plan was to stop a Japanese invasion at the beaches. But the moment these troops were mobilized for war, Wainwright and others took a look at them and realized this plan stood no chance. Now, let's be clear, this is not a reflection on the troops themselves. It's a reflection that they don't have the right equipment, and they don't have the right training. and there's no chance they're going to be able to stop the Japanese at the beaches. And very quickly after the Japanese land at Lingayen Gulf and on December 22nd, 1941 in the Philippines, it becomes clear that we're going to have to fall back on a much older plan to defend the Philippines, the one we had been working on for years and rehearsing, called War Plan Orange.
Right.
And by that plan, instead of trying to defend the full island defend the beaches, you're just going to try to defend the mouth of Manila Bay. And to control the mouth of Manila Bay, you need to control two key positions. One is the Bataan Peninsula, and the other is the tadpole-shaped island of Corregidor off the tip of Bataan.
Right.
And the problem, though, is because MacArthur's plan had been in effect before, we had sent the supplies that our troops would need in Bataan and dispersed them across the big island of Luzon instead of bringing them all to Bataan. And as a result, food and supplies would have been a problem no matter what under War Plan Orange.
Yeah.
It was very unlikely reinforcements would have arrived in time, and planners knew that. But it made it all the much worse to make the last second switch back to America's original plan for defending the Philippines.
Yeah, and my response to that is I was talking about this very thing with my son, who's a Marine, and we were looking. And by the way, for the readers, the maps in this book, absolutely amazing. I love maps. Great, whoever put those together, great job. So we were looking at the maps, and we're refighting the invasion of the Philippines, and he reminded me, and there's something you just said, the difference between a civilian and a soldier is practice, is drilling, it's getting it down so it's second nature. And you're right, they simply did not have enough time. MacArthur thought this wouldn't go down until like April of 42, that he had months to go. He did not, and it was just more, I guess, they were just expecting more of the Filipino troops untrained than they should have. So I just found that very interesting. And again, Wainwright said, oh, and can I just say, the part where MacArthur leaves and goes to Corregidor and Wainwright is still on the peninsula, defending, going around, trying to be that inspiring leader, that was impressive as hell. It moved me. And I'm sure he was doing it to try to inspire his men, but inspiration can only take you so far when you're running out of bullets and food and water and reinforcements. But again, that was an awesome part of the book, and I enjoyed that very much. So I just want to say thank you for that. So moving on to my next question, you've probably heard this expression. The first time I heard it, I think, was in a Tom Clancy book in the late 80s. But anyway, the expression goes, a whisper from a president is louder than a scream from anybody else. And since you're a former presidential writer, you come as close as any of us to putting words in a president's mouth, which is pretty impressive. I just wanted to ask, as a White House speechwriter, how does your experience writing for a president shape the way that you approach the history or the way you tell your story, like this particular book?
I think one of the great parts about being a White House speechwriter is you're a little bit like a fly on the wall.
Right.
Because the main job of a speechwriter is to help a president explain a decision he's making. And so the best way to figure out how to write the speech is to watch as that decision comes together. And because your job is then going to be able to explain it to the American people. And so for me, seeing President Bush make decisions during time of war, during time of financial crisis, was a window into how decisions are made. And that's been very useful as a biographer, because I've come to believe that, and I think this is something a lot of biographers believe, not necessarily all historians, that decisions that individuals make really do shape the course of history. And I certainly believe that's the case with this book. You have two men who made very, very important decisions and determined their place in history as a result.
Right. Good. Well said. So if I could go back to Wainwright for a second, because I was thinking about something you said. I've seen a picture of him after, emaciated, I think is the word we're going for. And in the negative 49 degrees, he must have suffered terribly. And what really struck me in your book was that the entire time he's like, what does the American people think of me? Do they, that he's thinking the worst of himself that they're thinking. And I just was wondering about his Japanese captivity and the personal cost of his decision to surrender for the sake of his men. It was almost like he was beating himself up more than anybody else was.
I think that's exactly right. The only person who was beating Wainwright up more was MacArthur.
Yes.
And I think Wainwright knew that. Wainwright writes in his diary, no other course of action would be honorable. But
Right.
honorable is not the word that Douglas MacArthur used to describe it at all. MacArthur called it unbalanced, especially when he heard that Wainwright had surrendered not just Corregidor, the island he was holed up on,
Right.
but all of the Philippines. And the reason he did it was he thought, where the Japanese made clear to him that they would carry out a massacre of the 12 to 13,000 people holed up inside this tunnel unless he did. And he believed that the remaining fighters in the Philippines could not accomplish enough to warrant this massacre. So he makes the decision to surrender for the sake of his men. He believes that Franklin Roosevelt would not have given him command of all the Philippines unless they wanted him to have this discretion. But he does know that MacArthur himself almost surely would not have approved.
Right.
And that haunts him. And, one of the things that happens shortly afterwards is, and Wainwright doesn't know this, is that George Marshall sends a proposal to give the Medal of Honor to Wainwright. He sends it to MacArthur, expecting that MacArthur will have no objections, because MacArthur just received the Medal of Honor under very dubious grounds after arriving in Australia.
Yeah.
But MacArthur does have objections, and he blackballs the nomination. And I do think, what would it have meant to Wainwright during those years of captivity had he received word that he had received the Medal of Honor? It would have meant everything to him. And, and one of the challenges, of course, of being a prisoner of the Japanese is he doesn't think MacArthur's going to understand the decision. Well, the Japanese certainly don't understand the decision because they don't believe in surrender, and especially they don't believe in officers surrendering like this. And there's almost a curiosity about Wainwright. Why didn't he commit suicide, or why, does he expect to be court-martialed?
Right.
And these thoughts haunt Wainwright during his captivity, and you can see him working through it. And every time, though, he does reach the same conclusion that there was no other choice that he could have made that would have been honorable. But even as he's released and his captivity ends in August 1945, even as he's gotten some hints that maybe he's become a hero in the United States, it's still in his mind that people in the United States won't understand this decision he's made, and he's worried.
You touch on this in the book, or I'm going to interpret something you touched on in the book. If you remove emotion, if you remove the concept of honor, it was the only decision. What good would it have done to slaughter tens of thousands of Allied troops? It would have served no purpose. And so it was the only decision, but I guess it made MacArthur look bad. And there was at least two occasions where MacArthur says to somebody under him, defend my honor or defend my reputation or whatever. I mean, as you could probably guess, I, maybe like a lot of people, I have a love-hate relationship with MacArthur. There was a lot to recommend him. There was certainly some things he could have worked on, but I think that goes back to what we touched on earlier about the expectations set for him by his family. How could he not, inflate the ego? But obviously later on in the war, he does gain some perspective. He becomes a very effective military commander, and he does some amazing things. So yeah, MacArthur. My blood pressure immediately goes up when I start talking about MacArthur, but he does do much better in the future. So it was good for the Allied effort. So if I could zoom out a little bit and kind of move forward to modern times, in your opinion, what lessons does Wainwright and MacArthur's story offer us today, given America's ongoing treaty commitments and rising tensions in the South China Sea?
Well, right. As you look at the map today, we're talking about a lot of the same places in the Pacific that we were talking about during World War II. And in a sense, reading a World War II history is a great way to understand, if you want to understand the current tensions in the South China Sea. Now, of course, today we're talking about China making grand claims to the South China Sea. And the Philippines does remain a treaty ally to the United States. We're bound to come to their defense. And you have Chinese ships ramming Philippine vessels in the South China Sea off the Philippine Islands. And And this is a potential flashpoint for conflict with China. And as I look at the story of Wainwright and MacArthur, I take the same lesson I think that Wainwright drew from his experience, which was the need for preparedness. Essentially, as he looked back on his ordeal, he basically concluded that he was just the general left holding the short stick. And in a sense, the United States had taken this colony across the Pacific Ocean, but in the interwar years was not willing to make the commitments necessary to be a great national, being a great military power.
Right.
And as a result, we were not able, we had to have a plan like War Plan Orange, which was always, strategists always knew there was not really a good chance of this succeeding. And it didn't succeed. And so because we weren't willing to pay that price, it was our soldiers who paid a terrible cost for that unpreparedness in the Philippines during World War II.
More rewards, more savings. With American Express Business Gold, earn up to $395 back in annual statement credits on eligible purchases at select shipping, food delivery, and retail subscription merchants. Enjoy the benefits of membership with the Amex Business Gold Card. Terms apply. Learn more at americanexpress.com/business-gold. Amex Business Gold Card. Built for business by American Express.
Right. And going back to what my son said, the difference between a civilian and a soldier's practice, they need the right equipment. They need to be able to train. They need everything they need in order to be ready. It's not rocket science. Either they're ready and they're fully equipped or they're not. And if they're not, they're going to pay the price immediately, and we're going to pay the price just after that. So I totally understand that concept. In fact, I think if I remember, the last little paragraph of your book was about this very thing, about we need to make sure, and I'm paraphrasing, we need to make sure this doesn't happen again. We need to be ready. So I totally understand that. And my son very loudly supported that idea. So I think we're all on the same page there. Going back to the word honor, because we've used that a couple of times, how would Wainwright and MacArthur, because they each pursued the Medal of Honor in their own way, but what do you think the word honor meant to those two gentlemen?
Wow, that's a great question. I think for MacArthur, he had almost he saw the Medal of Honor as his birthright.
Yes. Yes.
His father had received it, but he didn't receive it immediately during the Civil War. Douglas MacArthur, of course, was not alive during the Civil War, but when he was about 10 years old, his father had embarked on a long campaign to get recognition for what he had done as a young man during the Civil War and to receive the Medal of Honor. And he saw his father campaigning for it. And you can find, if you look at Arthur MacArthur's military files, not just about the Medal of Honor, but on lots of different subjects, he's constantly pursuing recognition for his achievements. And I don't want to make it sound like it's that odd, because this was a period of time when a lot of Civil War veterans were looking back on what had happened and hoping to get recognition for what they had done during the Civil War. So it wasn't necessarily that unusual, but Arthur MacArthur was certainly at the forefront of this movement. And so I think Douglas MacArthur, his conception of himself was very much tied to this medal and the idea that his life, his career would not be a success unless he had it. And you can see all throughout the years before World War II, and Douglas MacArthur as a young officer, he often takes extreme risks that in some cases don't seem to serve a lot of purpose, but to try to receive this medal. And I've been told you're never supposed to say you won the Medal of Honor, because nobody in their right mind would want to win the medal because of the sacrifice it's required to get it. But MacArthur wanted to win that medal. I mean, for MacArthur, it was winning the medal. And for Wainwright, I think it's really inseparable from the concept of sacrifice and duty and being loyal to your troops, and also being loyal to your commanding general, MacArthur. I mean, those values were such a part of who Wainwright was. And when I think about the sacrifices he had to make, and we haven't really talked about, but he was a gritty cavalryman who loved horses. And on the Bataan Peninsula, he has to order the horses of the last great cavalry unit in United States history to be eaten by his own men.
Yeah.
And, this is a man who really suffered and believed in sacrifice and believed in setting an example for his soldiers. And he received the Medal of Honor, and it meant everything to him. It meant a lot to him, but it was only because, in my view, it sort of validated what he had already done. In my view, he had already found honor. And I don't think I hope he didn't need that medal to know he had found honor in the end. But I think it certainly validated it, and it meant a lot to him to receive it from President Truman.
Right. Based on what you just said, the appropriate response should be, "Oh, I earned the medal, thank you." Yeah, as opposed to I'm going after this thing. And again, I'm sure he can't go back in time from 1942 and feel better about himself. But from that moment on that he earns the medal and for the rest of his life, hopefully that gave him some solace. We can only hope that it does. I want to go off the cuff for a second and just get your personal opinion on something. I just find this fascinating. In the book, you mention, how should I put this, Wainwright's fondness for alcohol, which of course is nothing new. It's certainly not new in the military. But and this is a weird question, but this is just how my brain works. I apologize. So when he's a prisoner, clearly alcohol is out of the question. He's barely eating. He's certainly not going to get that. I wonder, based on your learning about this man, was that maybe either an extra torment for him, or was it like, right, this is not going to happen, this is not an option, I'm going to switch some gear or whatever in my brain, and it's just not a part of the day-to-day trying to survive? Because, we all have our creature comforts, or whatever the appropriate term is, and now he's going to have to go years without something that he was getting on a regular basis that gave him a certain amount of comfort.
Right. And, and I think it's how you put it is well said, in the sense that Wainwright, drinking was a part of the Army. It was especially a part of cavalry culture.
Good point.
It wouldn't be notable to say that a cavalry officer drank at that period of time, but what was notable was that some people did mention that Wainwright drank, which suggested he drank a little bit more than a group of people who already drank a lot. But, you have different accounts of how much this actually mattered. There's one aide who said, he found that alcohol sort of fortified Wainwright and gave him a little bit of extra courage, but maybe it gave him a little bit of bravado that he didn't need.
Right.
And then another aide who said, he never noticed it made any difference on him at all. And he just, it wasn't really the big story of Wainwright's life, but it is the story in the sense that MacArthur insinuated in rejecting or blackballing the Medal of Honor nomination for Wainwright in 1942.
Right.
That if you look between the lines, what he's saying is, I will come forward and say that Wainwright was drunk at critical moments during the Philippines campaign. And that's what he's insinuating, that he's going to destroy Wainwright's reputation if George Marshall proceeds.
Yeah.
As to how it affected him during captivity, I mean, he was able to sometimes get alcohol on Bataan. There is some record of him sometimes having a drink on Bataan, but it was not nearly as often as it had been, of course, before the war. So I think he had some time without it. And I don't think that was. There were so many other forms of deprivations they faced during those years in prison. One thing that is sad is when he left and finally was released and came home, he finds, and of course his wife was part of this culture too, he finds that you can see in his diary how much he's looking forward to coming home to his wife and living out the rest of his days with her. Right. He finds that she's become addicted to alcohol and sedatives in his absence, and he's not able to control that, and eventually he has to make the very difficult decision to institutionalize his wife. So in a sense, he doesn't get the happy ending of the years together with his wife, which is one of the things that's sustaining him during his years in prison, is making plans for what life will be like with his wife. So it's a heartbreaking ending. And it's also a reminder of the costs, not just that our soldiers bear, but the costs that their families bear.
Good point, because she was suffering too, and that's how she coped. I guess it would be a fair guess. But it just adds maybe the word tragedy is too much, but to the tragedy, or at least the trajectory of what Wainwright had to go through, during World War II and after. A very, very intense story. So having said that, and we've kind of touched on this a minute ago, so he does kind of fade from the broader public memory, but despite, again, everything that we've covered so much. So do you see this kind of book as a restoration for his, I think, rightful place in history?
That's exactly it. And my hope is that with this book, Wainwright was once a very well-known figure when he returned from the war. He was considered a war hero. He received a ticker tape parade in New York City. I would like, my dream for this book is to restore Wainwright to his proper place in history. Mm-hmm. And I'd like when Douglas MacArthur is mentioned in the Philippines, you also mention Wainwright. When you mention the vow that MacArthur made to return to the Philippines, you also in the same breath mentioned the general who vowed to stay in the Philippines, even when that meant surrendering with his men and sharing the terrible ordeal that was ahead of so many of them.
Yes, and you just reminded me of something. The part of your book that I will never forget is after Wainwright is captured, the Japanese, they're going to do what they're going to do, but the psychological torture, they made him go over and over and over again. They drove him around to where he suffered, his men died, and he had to surrender. They put him through the ringer before they put him in a camp. So again, this man suffered so much for the decision he made, but that decision also saved tens of thousands of lives. So again, a very honorable man. And I just have to say the picture of him that I see of him after the war, he is a skeleton. He went through hell and back. But I'm obviously very proud of him for making it. Mr. Horn, I do appreciate your time today. Just a couple more questions, and then I'll let you go. I'm sure you're busy. If the readers had to take just one thing away from the fate of the generals, what would you like that to be?
I think it's very much what you said. I hope people appreciate and remember the sacrifice and courage that Wainwright and our other prisoners of war showed during World War II, and remember these stories of intense sacrifice and courage, and also to remember the cost that our country, and most important, are, to be honest, because it was not an evenly borne cost, our soldiers and the people of the Philippines, because they're the other people who really suffered. And we owed them better because they were a colony of the United States. This was not, Douglas MacArthur was right about one thing. The Philippines were not just another island chain that could be, that in my opinion, could be bypassed on the way back to Japan. And I think that's a good point to make, because that's also part of this book. And he believed that we had been forced out at the point of a bayonet and we had to return the same way. And I think he was right, even if, in a terrible irony, his return resulted in the Japanese carrying out one of the worst atrocities of the war and destroying the city of Manila. Because when you visit the Philippines today, in the United States, people have different opinions about Douglas MacArthur, but the fact that he kept his vow is remembered in the Philippines. He is still a hero in that country, and it's a reminder of what it means when our country keeps its word, and it's not forgotten. And the United States remains a very popular country in the Philippines among the Filipino people.
Right. You just made me think of one of the planks of honor is keeping your word. And he did, and the Americans did. So, again, one of the better moments of World War II. So before I let you go, just one last thing. Is there anything else that you would like to add about the fate of the generals, any experiences you had? I'm going to try very hard, even though I love to talk, to give you the last word today.
Well, I think as we're 80 years to the end of World War II, for me, this book was a reminder that there are still so many stories that we have more to learn about. There have been so many books written about World War II. It's easy to say, what is there left to say?
Right.
Well, when I went into the archives, I found so many papers and letters that I don't think had ever been read by anyone outside of General Wainwright's family in many cases. Right. And so this was a reminder for me that World War II is still, and you know this better than anyone because of this outstanding podcast, there's still more stories that we have to tell, and there's more heroes that we should be raising up And there are more lessons that our country should be learning from this great struggle.
Absolutely. Whenever I think about the records, the memoirs, everything that's been produced from World War II, I think about that scene in Indiana Jones where they go into the giant warehouse and there's all those crates that haven't been opened yet. They haven't been touched. There's a lot more stories out there. And I hope you get to tell some of those stories. So thank you very much for your time today. The book is The Fate of Generals, MacArthur, Wainwright, and the Epic Battle for the Philippines. This book has been available since April 15th, tax day. And I have to tell you, sir, in avoiding filing my taxes, I found your book. So it was a win-win for everybody, but I did get the taxes done on time. But seriously, this book was very well written. It gave me a lot of things that I did not know, and I've read a lot on MacArthur. And again, the maps were just, the people are really going to enjoy this. So thank you for your time today, sir, and thank you for this book.
Thank you so much for having me on today.
At the International Spy Museum, we often get the inside scoop on little-known stories from the shadow world.
There's this underground spy war on American campuses.
But here's a secret. You don't have to visit the museum to hear these stories.
These are the most consequential discussions and decisions you will have in your career.
Tune in wherever you get your podcasts every Tuesday and discover how global intelligence shapes our everyday lives.
Welcome to True Spies, the podcast that takes you deep inside the greatest secret missions of all time.
Suddenly, out of the darkness appeared Bin Laden.
You'll meet the people who live life undercover. What do they know? What are their skills? And what would you do in their position?
Vengeance felt good. Seeing these people pay for what they'd done felt righteous.
True Spies from Spyscape Studios, wherever you get your podcasts.